So, welcome to lesson 2.4, periodization, where periodization is the habit of dividing history into definite historical periods, like the medieval period. And I'm going to describe the concept in a bit more detail. Then I'll consider some criticisms of the practice of periodization. Then we'll review some ideas about the methodology of periodization. And lastly, I'll describe a whole range of periodization schemes, from the conventional and traditional ones to more idiosyncratic ones. So let's start with the concept. And I've put up the traditional periodization of history into ancient, medieval and modern, with the turning points typically being put at AD 500 and AD 1500. Now, a periodization like this is an elementary form of theoretical history. It's saying that history is not just a random series of events, but there's a structure to it. We can identify these separate phases. So it's kind of the beginnings of theoretical history. We're identifying a pattern to the past. And one question that immediately arises is, insofar as this is or represents, a theory of history, is it correct? What is the theory behind this, and can it be justified? Or is it just that this is got practical utility? It just is a way for us to get our head around the past. We divide it up like this. We're not necessarily claiming there's any great logic to it. It's just a way for us to kind of organize the data. So which is it? Well, ideally, theoretical historians would like to move towards theory-based periodizations that can be justified. But at the moment, that's very much in its infancy. But we don't want to throw away the idea of periodization, because it is very useful to help us organize and structure the past. And what's more, having got periodizations, we can then question them and ask, well, why are we dividing it up this way? What lies behind that? And that may lead us towards theory. So at the moment, we're not going to be purist about the theoretical correctness of periodizations. We're going to be more interested in their practical utility, but while recognizing that this is ultimately a goal that we should move towards. And of course, even if we have theory-based periodizations, we might find that we want different periodizations for different circumstances. So if we're studying economic development, we may want to focus on different issues than if we're studying the history of geopolitics. And so because we've got different issues, they may divide up in different ways and we get different periodizations. Another question that arises is that when we develop a periodization like this, are we saying something about the special character of the period, each period? So if we're talking about the medieval period, are we saying that there was something special about society for this period of 1,000 years that makes us lump all that time together and call it medieval? So there was something special about that time. Or is it just the turning points that are important? Or is it that we're saying something happened here around 1500 that causes us to identify everything before as medieval and everything after as modern? But what we're focusing on is this turning point, this particular event or set of events that we're identifying as the division between those periods. Well, some periodizations of history do tend to emphasize turning points. So for example, in the history of the Islamic world, we might identify the pre-Islamic period and the Islamic period. And the dividing point between those would be Muhammad's flight to Medina, which is considered the beginning of the Islamic era and calendar. And in identifying that as the turning point and talking about pre-Islamic, we're not suggesting that the pre-Islamic society, the society of Arabia just before the flight to Medina, was different in any fundamental way from the society just after it. So we're not identifying a special character to the period. We're just saying that it was before the flight to Medina. We're just focusing on that turning point as a dividing line in history. And perhaps another possible example is that in the ancient Egyptian civilization, it's divided into separate kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and between these there were the intermediate periods, the first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, and there was a third one because the history carries on as well after that. Now, these intermediate periods were times of collapse of the state and times of disorder and chaos lasting a few decades. So with Egyptian history, are we saying that there was a great difference in the way Egyptian society was organized in the Middle Kingdom versus the Old Kingdom? Or is it just that there was this period of chaos and so we just start a new period? But we're not necessarily saying that there was anything different about the way the pharaohs carried on and the way society and the economy were organized. Now, I'm not saying which is which here, but I'm just using this to highlight the question. Is it the turning points that cause the periodization, or is it that it's something about these the different ways society was organized in these times? And I think you can see that it's really the intermediate periods that lead people to identify these separate kingdoms, rather than, you know, just ignoring the intermediate periods and saying, oh look, things were so different here that we must call it something different. It's really the intermediate periods that trigger the periodization. But, you know, we can ask that question and then think about, well, you know, maybe there are things we can identify that were different in the Middle Kingdom. So this question leads us to think a bit more deeply about our periodization. And furthermore, there are, in sociology, sociologists who talk about issues of autopoiesis, or self-reproduction of society. And here I'm particularly thinking about the sociologist Nicholas Luhmann. His autopoiesis is his term, and Pierre Bourdieu, self-reproduction, is his buzzword. And what they're saying here is that a society is self-reproducing. Autopoiesis means it makes itself, if you go back to the Greek roots of these words. So society kind of makes itself. It means that the different parts of society all work together to reproduce that form continuing forward. So it's like the organs of the body. All the parts of society depend upon each other, and they're all necessary to the whole, just like the organs of the body. And you can't change or take out one part without affecting everything else. You know, if you take out you can't say, well, we don't like the way your heart is working, we'll just get rid of that and things will carry on. They won't, because every part is necessary to the whole. So all the institutions of society, because they work together, they form this kind of self-consistent arrangement. There, so I've put institutions, I'm talking about this, the institutions of society form this self-consistent arrangement. So they're all shaping each other, and they're all consistent with each other. So they form a set of interlocking practices in society. So if we think, for example, about feudalism, for example, feudalism, which characterized the medieval period, it was a set of interlocking institutions. The church, the nobility, the economic practices, all fitted together in this kind of self-consistent way. And so when we're talking about the medieval period and characterized by feudalism, we are talking about a set of institutions that were interlocking and that are very different from what we have today. All those institutions of feudalism have disappeared, and we have now a different set of interlocking institutions. So that suggests that in our periodization there should be something special about the period. That is why we identify it as different from the later or earlier periods. And I talked in the last lesson about one suggestion as to what caused the transition from the medieval to modern world was the Black Death. So the Black Death wiped out a large part of the population, and because the feudalism depended on this hierarchical structure with the peasants at the bottom supporting the whole arrangement, when a lot of the peasants died, it kind of undermined the whole structure and feudalism collapsed. That's a simplified version of that theory. And that theory, though, has criticisms, and people will point out that, well, there were other things going on at this time that also were changing society. So things like the discovery of the New World, opening up new commercial opportunities and changing the relative value of different locations, whether the Atlantic societies were on the edge of the world or on the in the middle of it. The discovery of the New World changed the geographical significance of different parts of Europe. Also the invention of printing, which made it much easier to produce books, and it tended to break the power of the church, which had traditionally, when in the days when books had to be copied out, had controlled the flow of information, because it was largely monks that did the business of transcribing books. But with printing, it was secular people now could control the flow of books, and it also made books cheaper and more widely available. So it freed up access to information. And one of the effects of that then in undermining the power and the authority of the church was Martin Luther's Reformation, which used the power of the printing press, because Luther printed pamphlets that he was unable to distribute. So these and maybe a whole range of other factors fed into this turning point, ending the medieval period and producing the modern one, leading to the modern one. And this is kind of what we'd expect, that if we're saying with these sociologists, the society is a set of interlocking institutions propping each other up. When there's change, we should expect change to be in many areas at once. All the institutions have to change. So we should find a whole set of interlocking causes, and these causes do interlock. As I've suggested, that printing was relevant to the Reformation. The Black Death as well was kind of involved, because one of the effects of the Black Death was it killed older people preferentially. So in the church they find that all the older clerics were dying off, as the younger ones were coming in, there was nobody to train them up. So this allowed the new ideas to come into the church. Again, helping the Reformation. So we've got a set of interlocking causes that produce changes to an interlocking set of institutions. And so what we're saying here is that it's kind of not a question of is it the character of the period or the turning points. It's kind of going to be both, typically, that there was a whole set of things going on here that caused a transformation of the world, of society in a certain way, but also so that tends to divide one from the other, but also each period had its own interlocking set of institutions which were different, and so that is why we can call them different periods. So let's consider some of the criticisms of periodization. And the historian Carroll Quigley pointed out that historians are always complaining about periodizations, but it's a concept that they can't really live without because they're already inventing new ones. So, for example, historians can criticize this division into medieval and modern and saying, you know, it really obscures some similarities between the late medieval period and the early modern period. And Carroll Quigley gives the example of how they then some historians define an age of reason. Seeing a similarity between the emergence of reason in the late medieval theologians feeding through into the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. So they're, you know, criticizing this periodization, but they're developing a new period to replace it. So periodization has problems, but it's also incredibly useful. And I'm going to discuss 5 specific criticisms of periodization. The first one is that it is backward looking. So when we call this the medieval period, did the people who were living in that time see it as the medieval period? Medieval meaning the Middle Ages. Did they say we're in the Middle Ages? Well, of course they didn't, because they weren't in the middle at that time. They were at the forward edge of history. They wouldn't have seen themselves as this special period. They would have just seen themselves as, you know, the future today. So when we look back at the medieval period, we're perhaps picking out aspects of it that are important to us because they're different from what we're doing. But they wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't necessarily in the Middle Ages have seen those things as particularly important. So our characterization of these periods is just from our perspective. It's not necessarily what the, you know, lived experience of people at that time was. Another criticism is that a periodization ends up being a mental straitjacket. It constrains our thought. So in the history departments in the universities all around the world, you'll see the Department of Ancient History, the Department of Medieval History, and the Department of Modern History, and they keep themselves to themselves. And so when students are being trained up, you know, they're taught to think, oh, this is medieval history, and it gives them certain expectations, and they regard it as very different from modern history. And also the people who work in these different areas don't talk to each other. So there might be issues in modern times that are relevant to understanding things happening in medieval times, but nobody is going to pick up on that pattern because, you know, they separate it's a kind of academic division of labour. They separate their inquiry into these different areas. Another criticism is that it is region centric. So people have said this division, yes, it works well for the West, but you don't see that in China or India. You know, they weren't divided into these medieval, modern at the same time points as in the West. And because India and China, nevertheless, throughout this period were communicating with the West, I mean, even back in Roman times, in the ancient history, the Silk Roads, and there was a lot of trade across the Indian Ocean. There were Romans living in India. There were Indians reaching the Roman Empire. So because China and India were interacting with the West throughout this period, if these periods don't appear in Chinese and Indian history, then it suggests there's some problem with that periodization, because if it's only covering part of the overall system, then it's not really describing the historical interactions that were taking place. And a fourth criticism is that it's taking a kind of elite perspective. It's a small part of society that is affected, or that we're focusing on in these periodizations. So the peasants in the ancient to medieval times, their lifestyles were probably very similar. They, sowed the fields, they reaped the crops, they mucked out the animal stables, they paid their taxes. Their lifestyle didn't change very much, so they wouldn't necessarily say, oh gosh, we're in a different period now. The vast bulk of society just maybe carried on the same, and it's only the elites, the intellectuals and the aristocrats whose lives changed in any way. So our periodization is really focusing on a very small part of society and not the bulk of human experience. And the last criticism is that there's a problem with the idea that there's this sudden change. At a certain point, the medieval became the modern world, when in fact there was a vast overlap of institutions. Institutions and technologies took a long time to change and be adopted. So, for example, if we're saying that the printing press was a factor in the conversion of the medieval period into the modern period, well, the printing press, when it first came in, was just in a few cities, and it took a long time to spread out to the provinces and to achieve the same changes there, maybe hundreds of years. So there is a vast overlap, and things were much more gradual. And when you're imposing this kind of cookie cutter thing on top of it, you're obscuring the real processes that were taking place. So these are 5 criticisms, and there's something we should be aware of. It's not to suggest that we should then say, oh well, periodization is a load of rubbish and we shouldn't be doing it. It's just to be aware of these issues, so that when we have our periodizations, we can ask ourselves questions to make sure we're not falling into traps. Is this region-centric? And if it is region-centric, at least we need to be aware of that. Are we just focusing on the elite, or is this something that really affected everyday people's lives? Okay, so let's talk about method. And I've put up here some historical periods that have been variously identified. So at the top we've got Romanticism. Romanticism was a movement of the late 18th, early 19th century that emphasised nature and harmony with nature. It was kind of a reaction to the industrialisation and the factory machine world that was coming in at that time. So that was the Romantic movement, and people might talk about the period of Romanticism. And in doing that, then, we're focusing on an issue of culture and ideas. We're using a particular cultural movement to identify a period. With the pre-farming period we can talk about. So before the invention of agriculture, that was the pre-farming period. Here we're focusing on an issue of ecology, humans' interaction with nature and with the environment. Pre-farming, we just lived off wild foods. Post-farming, or after this period of pre-farming, in the farming period, we started transforming nature for our own purposes. So this is focusing on that issue of ecology. Then we might talk about the period of capitalism. So here we're focusing on economic matters as our criterion for identifying a particular period. So the economic behaviour changed, we entered the period of capitalism. Another period might be, people might talk about is the post-Columbian period, the period after Columbus had discovered America. The world changed. So we can talk about the post-Columbian period. And here we're focusing on issues of cross-cultural interaction. I might just say that, I'll tend to use an X to mean cross, also Christ as in Christian, but so cross-cultural interaction. When we talk about the post-Columbian period, that's what we're saying is important to identifying periods. That when Europe began to interact with the Americas, that created a new historical period. With the Iron Age, we're focusing on technology. A new ironworking technology came into existence, and so we identify a new historical period. What about the Ming period? We have a Ming vase from the Ming period. Well, there obviously we're focusing on a dynasty as defining the periodization. There were different Chinese dynasties. The Ming was one of them. So when the Ming was in power, that was the Ming period. With the Roman period, there we're focusing on the existence of an empire as the basis for our periodization. The time when the Roman Empire was a going concern and the time when it wasn't. That's what's defining our periodization. The Islamic period, that we might use that, for example, in Spain, where the Islamic rule came and went. So we could talk about the Islamic period. And that is when what we're talking there as the basis of our periodization is the dominance of a particular religion. And lastly, with feudalism, we're talking about a set of social institutions. So we're using the existence or non-existence of a certain set of social institutions as the basis of identifying a period. And the point of this then is that we've got many different bases for periodization. We can think about in very different issues to develop our periodization. And this leads on to the work of Leonid Grinin, the Russian theoretical historian, about the principles that we ought to adopt in developing periodizations. So let's look at Grinin's 6 principles. If you're developing a periodization of history, this is Grinin's advice on how you ought to do it. So the first one, in light of what we've just been looking at, is that you should have a common basis to it. You shouldn't talk about the Roman period following the Iron Age which was then in turn followed by feudalism. You're using different bases. You're using an empire, you're using a technology, you're using a set of social institutions. That you shouldn't do that. If you're going to use empires, then use empires all the way through your periodization. Second piece of advice is that the sub-periods, if you're going to have major periods and then smaller sub-periods, they should be completely contained within the main periods. So we saw what Carol Quigley said about how people have the periodization, ancient, medieval, modern, and then they suggest an age of reason that overlaps them. Brinnan is saying that's no good because it undermines your major periodization. It's saying, well, this turning point wasn't a turning point. It was, there was this whole age of reason which incorporated it and overlapped it. So there's no logic to that. If you're going to have this periodization with sub-periods, they have to be within the major periods. His next piece of advice is that your periods should be of roughly equal duration. You don't want to have a periodization that involves a period lasting 1,000 years and then a period of 10 years and then another period of 1,000 years. The different periods should be, approximately equal. Then he suggests that you ought to have a theoretical justification. If you're going to talk about the medieval period versus the modern period, you need to have some theory as to what was different that justifies such a distinction. And as we discussed, well, yes, that's the ideal to which we should be moving towards, but is not necessarily been achieved so far. His fifth point is that we should see these periods that we're defining in terms of a particular basis, that we also see them as being distinct in other bases. So if, for example, we identify the Iron Age, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, I'll put those up here. If we have a periodization, the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, the basis of this periodization is technology. But what Grinnan is saying is that we should also find that there are differences in other aspects of society between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, if we've got a good periodization. And that perhaps relates to this whole idea of the way society is self-reproducing, a self-consistent set of social institutions, or we could say a social gestalt. It's the whole. Every part of it is necessary. It forms a whole thing. It's not just a random collection of institutions. The institutions fit together to make something that's more than the sum of its parts, a gestalt. And in fact, indeed, in the Iron Age, we do find that society was organised differently. It was more aggressive. There were came into existence permanent standing armies, professional militaries, and empires, large empires, and so on. So, in this periodization, Bronze Age to Iron Age, it suggests it's a good periodization because we can find the distinctions between them, not just in technology, but in other aspects of society, in other bases of periodization. And his last point is that your periodization should have some objective data to back it up, to make it observable. You should be able to observe it in the data. So, for example, it might be changes in population density or something like that, or changes in the extent of empires, that they suddenly were much bigger here. But something that you can point to that shows that there was a distinction between these periods. So let's take a look at some periodization schemes. And as I said, I'll consider some that are conventional and well established, and others that are more esoteric, ones that have been proposed by particular authors but not necessarily caught on. And the point is not to memorize all this, it's just to give you an overview of what's out there. And some of the ideas and concepts may crop up later in the course. So it's useful that if later on I refer to, say, late antiquity, that you have some idea of what it means. And let's start with some weird and wonderful ones with the world of myth. So in Judeo-Christian legend, there's something called the prophecy of Elias, who was a rabbi of around 200 BC. And he said that the history of the world is divided into these three stages. Starting in 4000 BC, there's 2000 years before the law, and by the law he meant the law of Moses.
We're talking about the Ten Commandments.
2000 years under the law, and then 2000 years of the Messiah. And that leads up to the end of the world. And then the Aztecs saw the world as going through 5 suns. And we're in the 5th sun, the 5th world. And in Hindu thought, the ages of the world are called yugas. And there are 4 ages, Krita, Treta, Dvapara and the Kali Yuga. And we're currently in the Kali Yuga, which is believed to be the least happy age of all. And it's also not something we can expect to end anytime soon, because these yugas, well, there are different interpretations of them, but according to one interpretation, they last 400,000 years. And we've already seen the scheme of the poet Hesiod, that the world is divided into gold, silver, bronze, heroes and iron ages. And the Christian theologian St. Jerome, who lived around AD 400, tried to put dates to these ages. So he suggested that the Golden Age started around 1710 BC, and then to 1674 BC, and so on up to the Iron Age beginning 1103 BC. And we've been in the Iron Age ever since. And this concept of metal ages may have inspired the Danish archaeologist Christian Jørgen Thomsen, who studied artifacts in the Danish archaeological collections and came to realise that humans had gone through 3 stages in terms of the materials of their tools. So from stone to bronze to iron, with bronze coming in from around 3000 BC and iron coming in from 1000 BC. Now, these dates in fact vary greatly with the region. So, for example, the Bronze Age in Britain started much later than it did in the Middle East. And there are also subdivisions of the Stone Age. So we have the Old, Middle and New Stone Age. And people also identify a Copper Age between stone and bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and usually tin. So people first discovered the possibility of using copper, and then it was only later that they discovered that it's better if you mix it with tin. And then, are we still in the Iron Age, as we've discussed before? or some people suggest that we are now in the space age, or the age of plastic, or the information age, or whatever. And another way that archaeologists periodize the past is in terms of assemblages of tools. So people used a certain set of tools for a period of time, and then they developed or switched to another set of tools, usually more sophisticated tools. And so here is a periodization applying to Western Europe that's based on particular sites in France where these assemblages of tools were first found, so the type sites. So we have the Mousterian kit, the Aurignacian period, the Gravettian period, the Solutrean period, and the Magdalenian period. As I say, all named after places in France where new toolkits were found. So let's take another look at our classical periodization into ancient, medieval and modern history. And medieval, of course, means just the Middle Ages, so called because it's in the middle. And I'm going to discuss just a few refinements of this scheme. And firstly, the precise dates, the precise turning points for AD 500 more precisely might be considered to be AD 476, which was the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the end of the reign of the last Western Roman emperor. And this AD 500 date could be considered more precisely 1492, when Columbus discovered America. And then the ancient world, some people stop that around about 600 BC. So that's ancient history up to 600 BC. And then we have the classical period up to the usual boundary of 476. And people talk also about late antiquity from around AD 300 up to, let's say, around AD 700. So spanning the end of the Western Roman Empire, the late antique period, the late antiquity. And then starting here around this 500, people also talk about the early Middle Ages, the early medieval period, going up to, that stands for early medieval, going up to about AD 1000. And people also use the term early modern for the first 2 centuries of the modern period, so from 1500 to about 1700, early modern. And another term might come across is, of course, the Renaissance, which might be considered to last from 1400 to about 1600. The Renaissance, the 15th and 16th centuries. And another term that we might come across is the Dark Ages, the European Dark Ages, which is around here, sort of overlapping late antiquity to the Middle Ages. And while historians these days don't like the term Dark Ages because it's considered pejorative, because these were in fact very creative times when the basic institutions of modern Europe were being laid down. But they were dark in the sense that we don't know very much about what happened in those times. They left behind very little architecture and very few documents, so Dark Ages. In Britain, the Dark Ages are dated fairly precisely between 400 and 600. 400 historical records stop, and 600 they start again, with almost nothing in the middle. And now the ancient period is subdivided into periodizations in its own right. So, for example, in ancient Iraq, Mesopotamia, people might talk about the Uruk period, the Assyrian period, and the Achaemenid period. And Uruk was a city, so this corresponds to the period when the city of Uruk was flourishing. The Assyrian Empire this refers to, so this is a period when the Assyrian Empire was dominant, and the Achaemenids were a Persian royal dynasty, so it refers to the period when the Achaemenid dynasty was in power. So you can see from this that these periodizations completely violate Greenin's principle. They're not on the same basis at all, and in fact most of the periodization schemes we are discussing don't agree with Greenin's principles. They completely fail to obey them, suggesting that the whole area of periodization is definitely something that theoretical historians will need to be working out over the time to come. And then another periodization of ancient history is based on the history of Egypt, which, as I've already mentioned, is divided into the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, and then the Late Period and the Ptolemaic period, and then ending with Egypt being absorbed into the Roman Empire in 30 BC. And again, as I've mentioned, these periods are divided by intermediate periods, times of disorder lasting for a few decades. And we could also talk about the pre-dynastic period before Egypt was united. And now we'll consider the periodization of China's history. So Chinese history is basically divided into a series of dynasties. And we start around 2000 BC with the Xia, who were a largely mythical dynasty. Then the Shang, who were a little bit less legendary. The Zhou, the Qin, the Han. So the Han Empire was around the same time as the Roman Empire. Then the Three Kingdoms period, the Jin dynasty, the South and North dynasties, the Sui, the Tang, the Five Dynasties period, the Song, the Yuan, which was founded by the Mongols, so Genghis and Kublai Khan, the Ming dynasty, and then China's last dynasty, the Qing, and then in the early 20th century, the Republic of China, and then today's People's Republic of China, founded in 1949. And I put these in different colours because the dynasties that are in green represent ones when China was united and peaceful, and the ones in red are the times when China was divided and subject to conflict and civil war. And the historian Mary Beth Cameron suggests that these dynasties can be organised into three main phases or periods. So firstly there's the origins, consisting of the Xia and the Shang. Then she identifies a phase of cycles of order and disorder. So you can see we go from disorder to order, and then back to disorder to order again, then back to disorder and order again. So there seems to be this cycle. So she identifies these three cycles, the Zhou through to the Han, the Three Kingdoms period to the Tang, and then the Five Dynasties to the Ming. And you can see just from the names here, the 3 kingdoms, the 5 dynasties, these were times of fragmentation and rival dynasties and rival kingdoms. And then the last phase is the modern period, so from the Qing dynasty up to today's People's Republic of China. And Cameron also provides a model of these cycles of order and disorder, in which they involve 3 stages. Firstly, there's a period of disorder. Then there's a short-lived dynasty that restores order. And that is succeeded by a long-lived dynasty that then rules over a period of order and peace. So let's have a look in more detail at her cycles. So Cameron characterizes the cycle in terms of the condition of Chinese society, the condition of the Chinese state, and the main activity, the main theme of what's happening in China at that time. So in the period of disorder, society is in a state of confusion. The Chinese state is division, and the main activity is fragmentation and civil war between all these rival elements. Then comes along this short-lived dynasty that reunites China. So it produces what she calls drastic integration. So it knocks everything together and forces China to be reintegrated. So the state becomes politically unified. So no longer there are lots of individual kingdoms and dynasties vying for power, but there's just one government ruling over the whole of China. And the activity during this period is of the new emperor, the new dynasty, conquering all the other parts of China and uniting them under his rule. And then that short-lived dynasty is followed by the longer one, which is now the integration has been achieved. So this new dynasty is able to rule over a period of peace and prosperity. And there occurs in the Chinese state cultural unification. So before, people were forced together and made to live together, but with cultural unification they come to feel that they are one people. That's also down here. The Chinese people become one. So they become culturally united. They develop just one common identity and culture. So, we have something that's perhaps a little bit similar to Polybius's anacyclosis, with this cycle from disorder to order and then back again. And Cameron considers some other possible periodizations that have been suggested of Chinese history. So one is to apply the ancient, medieval, modern terminology that's used in Western history. She suggests that by that token, the ancient period might be considered to last up to the Tang dynasty. The medieval period would then be from the 5 dynasties period to the Ming, and the modern period would be from the Qing up to today. And another terminology, periodization, that has been applied is to talk of the feudal period of Chinese history, the monarchical period, and the republican period. So in the feudal period, you had that kind of hierarchical structure to society that we discussed before is characteristic of feudalism. And then with the monarchical period, you've got one emperor who rules directly over the whole of society. And then the republican period, you've got rid of an emperor. And she says that the feudal period then could be considered to last up to the Zhou dynasty, then the monarchical period of the remaining dynasties from the Qin to the Qing, and then the Qing, and then you've got the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. And one last way of dividing up Chinese history, which is due to the historian Arnold Toynbee, whose name we've mentioned already several times, is to divide it into two civilizations. So he considers there to have been a break around the time of the Han and the end of the Han, the same way there was a break at the end of the Western Roman Empire. So in the West, we talk about the period up to the end of the Roman Empire as the ancient world, or the classical civilization, and then from the fall of the Western Roman Empire on, that's Western civilization. Well, Toynbee applied a similar idea, saying that up to the Han is what he called the Sinic civilization, up to the Han, corresponding to the classical civilization in the West, and then the Far Eastern. Civilization, which is from the Three Kingdoms on, and that corresponds to Western civilization. And now let's move on to some alternative schemes. And the first one to talk about is the concept of the axial age. Which was proposed by the philosopher Karl Jaspers in 1953. And the axial age is supposed to have lasted from 600 to 400 BC, though it may have sort of continued on, petering out a bit longer till around 200 BC, and there may have been a kind of foreshadowing, ramping up period starting around 800 BC. And the idea of the axial age is that it was a time when a number of key thinkers appeared all around the world, proposing a new kind of philosophical approach for humanity, and particularly a kind of new understanding of spirituality, from a collective ritual kind of thing to personal morality and personal relationship with the deity. And so what Karl Jaspers was picking up on was that this message seemed to be being presented by many key thinkers around the world, and he identified the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, the prophet Zarathustra in Zoroastrianism, the Buddha. So this is in Persia, the Buddha in India, Confucius in China, and Socrates in Greece. So all these thinkers appeared around the same time. And Jaspers thought that they weren't necessarily connected in any way. They didn't influence each other, but that the world was changing due to changing technologies and changing connectedness, and that led to pressure to come up with new ways of thinking about people and society and spirituality and morality, so that the same problems appeared all around the world and led to these similar responses. Though, I don't think we should necessarily rule out that in fact these people may have been aware to some extent of each other. Because ideas could certainly flow around in the world of that time. And the idea then is that this axial age provides a pivot to history. History changed at that point. It was an axis around which the world kind of rotated from one world to another, from one way of doing things to another. So that is the origin of the term, the axial age. So it creates a periodization of history into before the axial age and after the axial age. And the world before the axial age is very unfamiliar to us, but everything that came after the axial age kind of is something we can relate to. So things that we take for granted today, like metal coinage, for example, came in after the axial age and have been with us ever since, but before the axial age didn't really exist. So in a simple thing like that, there's a fundamental difference between the way the world worked, and it's really a question of different values and attitudes that these characters were responsible for communicating to humanity. That's the idea of the axial age. Now, a recent paper has examined this, and I think they were using the CSHAT databank. So these were theoretical historians, I think, using the CSHAT databank or some variation on it. And they looked statistically about the appearance through history of new ideas and new moral values, and they found that there was no special character to this supposed axial age, that there was no statistically significant evidence that new values and ideas were more likely to emerge then than at other times. So, I don't suggest we necessarily take that as read, because some people might say, well, that's what your numbers seem to show, but we'd have issues with those numbers. And, qualitatively, we certainly seem to see some kind of change. And some people, if you read the work of, for example, the British archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, and he's written a number of very good popular books like Europe Between the Oceans, and he's not talking about the axial age, but you find that in his work, 600 BC often appears as a significant moment. It was a time, for example, when there was an acceleration in the spread of iron. So by 600 BC, we're in the Iron Age, but iron was still a relatively rare commodity. But from about 600 BC, after that, iron really spreads and becomes ubiquitous. So it becomes really transforming of society from around 600 BC. 600 BC was also the time when there were some major geographical discoveries by the Phoenician traders and voyagers who were moving out of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. And 600 BC is also a time when we find rapid urbanization. So people started to be crowded together into cities. So there does seem to be something about 600 BC that, there was a time of great transformations in the way people were living and the kind of knowledge they had about the world. So although, this paper has rejected the idea, people were still coming back to the feeling that there was something going on at this point. And a couple of people who very recently have taken the idea of an axial age quite seriously, having written a book on the subject, are Ken Baskin and Dmitry Bondarenko. And they not only talk about this axial age, but they suggest that our own time is a new axial age. And they say that's because what characterized the axial age was these kinds of things. People were quite stressed and challenged, or society was stressed, and people were challenged by these new technologies and the new ways of living. And this feeling of stress in society led to people to come up with new philosophies that help people cope and adapt to the rapidity of the change and also the new conditions that they were living under. And what Baskin and Bondarenko are saying is that we're going through exactly the same thing today. We're living through a time of rapid technological change, but also rapid change in society due to the much increased connectedness of the world and the much greater contact between different populations and the way we're mixed up, much more mixed up together. And so they suggest that just as this happened in this previous axial age, our own axial age should expect some kind of new philosophical, moral, religious dispensation. So they're kind of looking out for the new prophets who are going to do what these people did and give people a philosophy that suits them for the new era going forward after this axial age. So the next thing to talk about is Leonard Grinin's concept of production principles, which divide history into four phases, four great periods. The first one is the hunter-gatherer period from 38,000 BC to 8,000 BC, when people lived freely off the land. And then from 8,000 BC is the craft agrarian production principle. So when almost all of humanity was involved in farming the fields and living by simple crafts. And then from 1430, and I think this is the invention of the printing press, we moved into the production principle of trade industrial. So this was a time of ocean voyaging and long distance trade and the Industrial Revolution, mechanization, factories and so on got started then. And then that lasted until 1955, which is the invention of the transistor, when, according to Grinin, we moved into the current production principle, the scientific cybernetic. And we will be discussing these production principles in more detail later on when we come to issues of social evolution and progress. But I present them just now as a kind of periodization of history. And Grinin might object to the idea that they're a periodization because they defy one of his principles, which is that the periods should be of similar duration. But if we took the logarithms of this, then they would be more of a similar duration. But he identifies the coherence and the division into four, because within each production principle there's the same, we can observe the same kind of evolution. For example, of the idea starting somewhere and then spreading out to the rest of the world. That seemed to happen in each of these production principles and in a similar sort of way. And now I've put up this chart of world population because Grinin's colleague Korotayev says that if we look at this chart of world population, it doesn't seem to line up with Grinin's production principles. So while this might be a good scheme, say, for Europe or Eurasia, it doesn't apply to the world as a whole. So let's have a look in a bit more detail at this chart. So world population was growing hyperbolically. So at first very slow growth, but then a sudden acceleration, and it was shooting off to infinity, a singularity, sometime before the year 0, before AD 1. And it would have, reached a singularity in about 200 or 300 BC. But it didn't, and what happened was that population actually turned over and stagnated at that point, so during the time of the Roman Empire. But that eventually started to turn up again onto a new hyperbola and was heading towards a singularity that would occur in around 2026. But in the 1960s, 70s, that hyperbolic growth came to an end and world population started to turn over again and slow down, and that's where we are now. So Korotayev talks of the older hyperbola, the younger hyperbola, and the time now, where the regime now, when we're not on a hyperbola at all, we've turned over. So he says, no, these principles don't apply as global periods or divisions of history. They're just these three phases: the older hyperbola, the younger hyperbola, and today the post hyperbolic regime, when world population is maybe coming to some equilibrium on Earth. And one other periodization scheme perhaps to mention here is of the historian William Green, who said that there are three phases up to 1000 BC, which is the beginning of the Iron Age, then up to around the fall of the Roman Empire, around 400 to 600. That's what the fall of the Roman Empire, and then up to 1492, which is obviously Columbus. So he identifies these three turning points. So there's the period up to then the period between those 2 points, the period between those two, and then the period since. Well, again, Korotayev would say, well, no, if you look at this chart, there's nothing happening really around 1000 BC. And with Columbus, it doesn't show up on this chart. So he would go back to identifying these as the key turning points in world history. Another contemporary theoretical historian who's tried to offer sort of grand periodization of human and world history is Graham Snooks. And he suggests that there are in the human story, three main stages. Firstly, what he calls the Great Dispersion. Which is when humans were spreading out from their point of origin. So this is from 1.6 million years ago to up to about 9,000 BC in his reckoning. So at this time, the world was empty. People were able to move away from each other, so they could solve their problems of living together by moving away and keeping the population density on the Earth constant. And when he's starting in 1.6 million years ago, that's obviously a lot earlier than the time frame that I put on theoretical history that we're concerned with, but it extends up to, so you know, and it's concerning pre-human species, pre-human hominids, but it also covers the period of true humans, modern humans, up to 9,000 BC and the beginnings of agriculture. And then he says the next stage that we moved on to then at that point, which is really when the Earth was full, is what he calls the Great Wheel. And he dates this from 9,000 BC up to AD 1780. And what he means by the Great Wheel is that it was a time when things were rising and falling. Empires rose and fell. And the key point is that it was a zero-sum game. So a society could make itself more prosperous by conquering its neighbours and getting access to their resources. But it could only enrich itself at the expense of those neighbours. And then it would eventually decline, and one of those neighbours would expand, build its own empire and seize their resources. But so societies could go up and down, but only at each other's expense. That was the Great Wheel, a whole series of cycles. But then with industrialization from 1780, he said actually it was no longer a zero-sum game. People could make themselves rich without taking from other people. So he calls this the Great Waves. And it's waves because there's still boom and bust in the economy, but there is an overall improvement in the standard of living. And that is because then you're not just seizing other people's resources, but by inventing factories and machines, you can become much more productive and then have more to go round. So it's non-zero sum. And the next person I'd like to mention is theoretical historian William McNeill. Who divided history into four phases, and I use history advisedly here, so the period of documentary history. He said from 3000 BC up to around 500 BC was the period of Middle Eastern dominance.
Dominant in the sense of being the focus of human progress.
So this was the period when ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia were the great civilizations on Earth, and really the only civilizations. And apart from the Indus Valley, and then later on the Chinese civilization appearing. But this was a period when Egypt and the Middle East really dominated the world. And then from 500 BC up to AD 1500, he says that is the time of Eurasian cultural balance. So at this point, the Middle East was declining, and the centre of power shifted into the Mediterranean, but also in China. The Chinese Empire was very strong and advanced, and so you had at the two ends of the Eurasian continent these poles of civilization, and also in India. But then from 1500 up to, he suggests, the year 2000, that's a period of Western dominance. So after Columbus, ocean navigation, colonialism, Western imperialism, the West came to dominate the world, and under the United States, the single superpower. But he saw that as coming to an end around the year 2000. He's no longer with us, he died some time ago. But he saw that coming to an end around 2000, and then from 2000 onwards, he argued that we're moving into a world of worldwide cosmopolitanism, I think was his term. So the West no longer dominates the world. The world has become much more equal again, or he imagined would be happening. What some might talk about as multipolarity. And so his point here then is that there is a kind of a pulse of a period where one part of the world dominates, and then there's a more even spread of power, and then a part dominates again, and then it moves to a more even spread of power. And I'm not suggesting by any means that, you know, I endorse this or this is true. This is just his theory, and we can question it and say, well, you know, does that work or not? And again, these are, at the moment, I'm just talking through periodizations, but all these things we will come back to in the appropriate places when we start to examine the theories that lie behind these things. So the next thing I want to talk about are the ideas of the theoretical historian George Modelsky, who was a professor of political science in the United States, and he died about 10 years ago. And he proposed a kind of periodization that is rather reminiscent of the prophecy of Elias, in that it starts in 4000 BC and is divided into these 2000-year chunks. And Modelsky drew attention to the fact that the population of the world at the first of these time points was 7 million, so with one figure in front of the millions. And then in 2000 BC, it was 27 million, two figures in front of the millions. Then in the year 0 or AD 1, it was 170 million, three figures in front of the millions. And then in 2000, it was 6,000 million, so with four figures in front of the millions. So there was an order of magnitude increase at these successive time points. And Modelsky's point was that this increase in world population necessitated a great change in the way people lived. So back in 4000 BC, when the population of the world was 7 million, you could afford to be quite wasteful in the way you lived because there was an awful lot of land per person. So you could have agricultural practices that were pretty inefficient, and you could just dispose of your waste without worrying too much where it went because there was an awful lot of land to go round. But you can't behave like that when the world population is 6,000 million. There's just not enough land to support people in wasteful and inefficient ways. So you have to develop better technologies for farming the fields. And you also need people to come together in big cities. And then that creates all sorts of problems about how you manage such large populations of people. You need police forces, you need economic systems, shops and markets to be able to bring in the produce that they need to live. And also you need sewage systems to take the waste away. So you need taxation and governments to provide those services. So he's kind of picking up on the same thing that Korotayev was pointing out, that it's the world population that kind of should be driving our ideas about periodization. And Modelsky is then picking up on the fact that these order of magnitude increases in population represent stages in the evolution of society to increasingly efficient, more powerful and more sophisticated forms. So that's one of Modelsky's ideas about periodization. And now I want to spend a bit more time talking about his fractal model of periods in history. So his fractal periodization. And by fractal, I mean that his model has short periods of history included within longer periods, which are included within even longer periods. So there's this hierarchical structure to the periodization, and it's self-similar. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so here is Modelsky's fractal periodization of history. And the basic period is the human generation, which he puts at 25 years. And then 2 generations make up a Kondratiev cycle. Now, we've kind of encountered this already back in lesson 1.2 when I talked about why we use mathematics to study history and the logistic curve of the number of people in space and how this lasted around 50 to 60 years. And I talked about why that is, that I use the analogy or the example of mining the moon, and that as you're mining the moon, you need, or if you want to mine the moon, you need geologists to find the mines where the minerals are. And as you find more and more mines, you start to need miners to exploit those mines. But you don't get miners by retraining seasoned geologists to start back at the bottom and become rookie miners. You recruit new people coming into the workforce. And then, so it takes a while, it takes a generation for the geologists to move out and the miners to move in. But as you get more and more miners, you're exploiting all your mines, and then you're running out of mines, so you start to need geologists again. And by the same token, you then start to recruit geologists at the bottom of the workforce, and it takes another generation for the workforce to change back from miners to geologists. So it takes 2 generations to go from geologists back to geologists. And this is a Kondratiev cycle, basically. It's a kind of cycle we observe in the economy, and it lasts about 50, 60 years, which we can say is 2 generations. I'll leave that up. So yes, in the next period then up is a Kondratiev cycle. And then 2 Kondratiev cycles, or approximately, to make the figures work later on as nice round numbers, he makes that 120, so approximately double that 2 Kondratyev cycles make a geopolitical long cycle, which is the time for the rise and fall of a great power. So like the rise and fall of the British Empire. Now actually, Modelsky says that the British Empire lasted for 2 geopolitical long cycles, but there were 2 episodes of rise and fall. But yes, so that's 2 Kondratyev waves make a geopolitical long cycle, and then 2 of these long cycles make what he calls a democracy formation wave. So this is the process of going from tyranny to democracy, and so that's at 250 years, roughly twice 120. And then 2 of those democracy formation waves amount to a political evolution process. So this is like Polybius's anacyclosis, to go from tyranny to democracy and back again. And then 2 of those make a world economy process, which he says lasts 1,000 years and involves the development of new markets and technologies from immaturity to a mature system. And then 2,000 years is an active zone process, which is a bit like McNeill's idea of a dominance of one world region. So the active zone was originally the Middle East, and then it lost its dominance, and then the active zone became the West, which is now losing its dominance again. Then 4,000 years, 2 of these active zone processes make up what he calls a world socialization process, which is, well, we'll perhaps discuss that when we go into more detail of his ways. I'll give you an example of what he's talking about there. And then lastly, 2 world socialization processes make up a world system process. And that is the highest level in his scheme. So we can get a feel for these last 2 if we look at his 4 world system processes. So starting in 28,000 BC, to 20,000 BC is one world system process. To 12,000 BC is the next, then to 4,000 BC, and then to AD 4,000. So you can see those are 8,000 year periods corresponding to these 8,000 year world system processes. And the first world system process he identifies is the development of language and culture. So he's suggesting that originally humans at this point were, little more than glorified animals, but as they developed human languages and human culture, they became proper humans, and that was an 8,000 year process for that to go from the beginnings to full maturity. And then the next world system process he identifies is the development of kinship and extended family groups. So we're talking about tribes and clans and tribes. So starting here, humans would just lived as individual families roaming the landscape, but they, over this world system process, they developed the idea that they belong to these larger social units, and so that's the extended family groups, which became, the basis for more larger and more complex societies. And then the next world system process is the appearance and evolution to maturity of agriculture. And the last world system process, which we're 3/4 of the way through, is what he calls world system evolution. So what he means by that is that at this point the world was divided into lots of regions which were, you know, sufficient to themselves. They were independent, they were not really interacting. But starting with the first cities and civilizations around 4000 BC and a little after, there started to emerge a world system of the entire world connected, and we're moving towards the end point, which is presumably a full global government, and the whole world is one unit and entity. Now, these dates here are an idealization, just to you know, show the scheme. But for the current world system process of world system evolution, he says the actual dates are 3400 BC to, he expects, around AD 5000. That's when he imagines the world will be fully globally unified under a global government. And that is what, you know, globalist entities like the United Nations are working towards. So let's just have a look now at a more detailed view of the current world system process, breaking it down into these socialization and active zone processes. So I'll draw that up as a table here. So this is Modelsky's breakdown of the current world system process, which, as I said, he sees as beginning in 3400 BC. And the world system process is divided into two world socialization processes, and each socialization process is divided into two active zone processes, and each active zone process is divided into two world economy processes. So the first world socialization process, beginning with this world system process, is he calls the rough world. So this was a time, very harsh time of you know, slavery and little care for ordinary people. But beginning in AD 930, he says, began the second world socialization process, which was the nicer world. So this is when systems of social welfare started to come in, and also the abolition of slavery, which began in Europe, you know, and spread to the rest of the world. Then the rough world is divided into two active zone processes. Firstly, the Middle Eastern from 3400 BC, when the ancient Egypt and the Mesopotamian civilizations were dominant. And then from 1200 BC, a shift to Eurasian. So the emergence of or the shift of power to the Mediterranean, and also to, in the Far East, to the rise of the Chinese Empire. So shift in the active zone. And then from 930, there were the active zone process shifted to oceanic. So this was when the Vikings, starting in 930 with the Vikings, were starting to be active in the Atlantic, and then of course later Portugal and Columbus and Britain and the Netherlands started to bring the world together through their command of the oceans, ocean navigation. And then going back to this active zone process is divided into two world economy processes. So the Bronze Age, the rise of the bronze-based economy, and then the second world economy process beginning 2500 BC in this active zone process was the Fertile Crescent. So the taking the plants and domesticated animals of the Fertile Crescent, which is in the area of the Near East, the Middle East, what's today, Lebanon, Syria, down through the Tigris, Euphrates, Mesopotamia, taking those agricultural technologies and spreading them through the rest of the world, or the rest of Eurasia anyway. And then with the next world economy process is the spread of iron, the Iron Age. And then from 100 BC, the emergence of the Silk Roads connecting the western and eastern parts of Eurasia. Then the next economic process, world economic process, was the emergence of national markets. So beforehand, say in Britain, the different parts of Britain were, didn't really trade very much with each other, and were economically self-sufficient. But starting from around 930, emerged a national market wherein the major centres, the products of the entire country, were brought together and were available. And so yes, the entire country became part of a single economy. And then from 1850, the next world economy process was the emergence of a world market. So now in the major centres of the world, the products of the entire world came together and were available in the shops. So the whole world was connected into a single market. And so that's where we've got to so far. And so he's not filling in the rest of this table because we've still got to get onto that. And we can break things down a bit further. I'll show another table now with focusing on this world economy process, the last one. The world economy process is from 930. We'll just have a look at how that works. Okay, so this is Model Ski's scheme of the current active zone process divided into these two world economy processes. Now, the world economy process is divided into two political evolution processes, and each of those is divided, as we see from here, into two democracy formation waves. But Model Ski also argues that a world economy process has four phases to the world economy process, and each of the sub-phases of the world economy process corresponds to one democracy formation wave. So in his analysis, he doesn't actually name or talk about the democracy formation waves. He talks about these periods in terms of as being phases of the world economy process. But they are equivalent to these 250-year democracy formation waves. And so yes, we've already seen previously that the world economy processes are the national market process beginning in 930 and the world market process beginning in 1850. So he then divides these down into the two political evolution processes of the Eurasian transition, which is when power was shifting away to broader Eurasia. Part of that was the emergence of the Islamic Empire, which united Eurasia from Spain to India and beyond. And then the next political evolution process he suggests begins around 1430 and is the Atlantic and Europe political evolution. So this is when the Atlantic coast of Europe and Western Europe generally became politically important. And then from 1850 there's the Atlantic Pacific political evolution. So this is the emergence of the United States as the leading world power. And then these political evolution processes, as I say, are split again, and we, instead of talking about the democracy formation waves, talk about them as phases of the world economy. So the first one he identifies here is the Song breakthrough, the Song dynasty breakthrough. So this was when in China more sophisticated forms of administration and government emerged, also with the technologies to support them, like printing, and that then spread to the rest of the world. Then beginning in 1190, he identifies the next world economy process as the commercial and nautical revolution. So this is the emergence in Europe of banking technologies and better shipbuilding. And then with this political evolution phase, the first world economy phase there was the emergence of oceanic trade from 1430, and with the experiments of Prince Henry the Navigator, and then Columbus, and so on. And then from 1640, the what he calls the industrial takeoff. So this is the beginnings of the factories, and then the Industrial Revolution up to 1850. And then the next world economy process, so the next phase of the world economy process is he calls the information process. So this is when the basis of industry shifted towards information rather than heavy industry. So the importance and emergence and importance of information technologies and things like newspapers, and then the telephone, and then computers and the internet and everything we have today, information technology. And again, he stops there because that's where we've got to. He sees this information phase going up to 2080, and the next phase of this world economy process, the world market development, is left blank because we don't know what will happen after 2080. And then if we take this information phase, he breaks that down again. I think I can just fit it in here. So this phase of the world economy process itself has 4 sub-phases. So this information process, he says the sub-processes consist of electric steel, and these sub-processes are now down to the Kondrachev waves. So there we said these are equivalent of democracy formation waves, which consists of 2 geopolitical long cycles, which consists of 2 Kondrachev waves. So if we divide this into 4, we're at the level of Kondrachev waves. So that was the emergence of electricity and the spread of steel, this kind of logistic process of a Kondrachev wave. They came in, they grew dramatically, and then they plateaued once they'd saturated the markets. And then the next Kondrachev wave is electronics. And after that, he says, came information technology industries. So with electronics, we've got transistor radios and what have you. With information technology industries, emergence of the importance of software and then social media. And then he leaves the last one blank because we hadn't reached that yet, but it's the last Kondrachev cycle taking us up to 2080. So we don't know what that is, though. Is it artificial intelligence, for example? And this is another thing we'll definitely be coming on to later when we talk about social evolution and progress. There are theories about about the Kondrachev cycle and what will come next. But yes, so we can speculate about what that might be, and we'll come back to it later on. So that is Modelsky's Fractal Periodization of History, and some illustrations of it. Okay, so now I want to go and look at some ideas about the periodization, the structure of the history of Western civilization. So I've drawn out a timeline here from AD 300 up to 2100, and we'll start with Oswald Spengler, who had the idea that Western civilization is divided into 4 phases: spring, summer, autumn and winter, and this is how he places them in history. So he sees it starting, Western civilization starting properly in AD 900, and its springtime went on to 1300, and then from 1300 to 1600 was the summer of Western civilization, and then came the autumn. It's still warm but getting colder from 1600 to 1800, and then from 1800 on we're in the winter of Western civilization, which he expected would come to an end sometime between 2000 and 2100. And our next periodization is historian Gerhardt, who's quoted by Alfred Kroeber, who sees Western civilization as having a sort of ramping up prologue period, and then he divides it into stage 1 from AD 1000 to 1200, and then stage 2 from 1200 to 1700. So you can see he ignores the medieval modern division and sees that as having a coherence of stage 2. So I suppose this was certainly pre-industrial, pre-machine. And then from 1700 is stage 3, the machine world that we live in now. And our next periodization is from Arthur Kroeber, anthropologist. So he sort of was partly inspired by Gerhardt's scheme, but he suggests that Western civilization had a prodromal phase, as he calls it. So all the kind of symptoms were there, but they hadn't yet. So all the Western civilization sort of emerged, but it wasn't yet obvious. So that's, he says, started around AD 500 or 700 and went on to AD 900, and then began the phase 1 of Western civilization, which was the medieval world, which he ends around 1325 and identifies then a transition up to 1575. So this was the transition from medieval to modern, and he identifies it not as a point in time, but as about 250 years of stress on society and change and transformation. So this is the time of the Black Death and the printing press and the Reformation and so on, the complete reorganization of society. And then from 1575 we move into phase 2, the modern world. And then he suggests that maybe another transition began in AD 1900. So we're actually in a phase like this between two worlds, between two ways of organizing Western civilization. And so we may be experiencing this as a fall and collapse. Now, he lived through the 20th century and saw the world wars, so he may have felt, and the Great Depression, so that may have inspired him to feel that he was in a transition then, a disruptive time. And I think today we also might feel that society is being disrupted and undergoing sort of rapid change, and we don't know where it's leading, and we may even have a sense that our society is declining and collapsing. Well, Kroeber says, well, that's how it might feel, but it's really a transition to a new phase of Western civilization. And the next person to consider is Carroll Quigley. And for this we need to know that Quigley has a model of civilizations suggesting that they all go through 7 stages, which are mixture, so when the ingredients of the civilization come together, the gestation of the civilization, the expansion of the civilization, then conflict within the civilization, out of which one part of the civilization emerges and to conquer all the others and form a universal empire. Then moving on to the stage of decay of the civilization, and then invasion of the civilization by foreigners, by migrants from elsewhere. And we'll be coming on to his theories later on in the appropriate part of the course. But just for now, we just need to know that he has these stages. And then this is his periodization of Western history in terms of those stages. Now, it seems a little arbitrary in that the phases can be repeated. So he suggests that the mixture of the civilization began around AD 300 and lasted until 750. From 750 to 970 is the gestation. Then there's the first expansion up to 1270. So this is a time of the Vikings, for example, and in Venice, in the Mediterranean, the beginnings of commerce there. Then came the period of first conflict. So, for example, in Britain, France, this is a time of the 100 Years' War. And then was a second age of expansion from 1440 to 1690. So this is Columbus and the things that came after him. And then a new stage of conflict from 1690 to 1730. So, lots of wars on the continent. And then a third stage of expansion. Then this is the time of full-fledged colonialism and imperialism up to 1929, the Wall Street crash, and the third stage of conflict, which he dated up to 1977, though he died around that time, and clearly the Second World War there is key to that. And finally, for another periodization of Western history, we have this ruler, 2000 Years of History, by the Metamorphosen Company, which I think is a German company. So this ruler starts in the year AD 1. Each segment is 200 years. So starting here in AD 1, they identify from AD 1 to 200 to 400, that whole period, as late antiquity, which is, a bit starting a bit earlier than I suggested before. But so they're really identifying the whole period of when Rome was ruled by emperors as late antiquity, before which was the Roman Republic. And then starting in AD 400, they identify that as the age of Christianity. So this is after Christianity had been adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire and was spreading throughout the countries of Europe. And then next, starting in 600, comes the period of Islam. So this is after the Muslim armies started moving out of Arabia, and around 700 conquered Spain. And then in 800, they have the early Middle Ages. And then from the year 1000 up to 1200, the High Middle Ages. And then from 1200 to 1400, the Late Middle Ages. And then we go into the Renaissance at 1400, and then around 1500, the Reformation. And then comes, starting in 1600, the Baroque, a period, really a term applying to art and architecture, so a period of greater flamboyance and also greater sophistication in art and architecture. And then the Enlightenment, modern science and philosophy and social theory. And then starting in 1800 to today, they identify as modern times. And now I'd like to look at some of the ideas of Dave Lepois, who's a contemporary theoretical historian and a very productive and interesting one. So one of his suggestions is that if we adopt a logarithmic scale, starting now and looking back first 50 years, then 150 years, 500 years, 1500 years, 5,000 years, and 15,000 years, then we're going back in steps of a factor of 3 each time. Roughly 50 times 3 is 150, 3 times 150 is approximately 500, and so on, going back. And he says that world history then divides up into equal sized chunks on this logarithmic scale. So the big theme of this first period from 15,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago is the development and spread of agriculture. Then from 5,000 to 1,500 years ago is ancient and classical civilization, so the emergence of the first cities and Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilization up to the Roman Empire. And then from 1,500 to 500 years ago is a time of the spread of trade and commerce through, for example, the Silk routes and trade from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. And then from 500 years ago to 150 years ago is the great age of capitalism, particularly international capitalism with the imperialism, European imperialism. And then from 150 years ago to 50 years ago is the emergence of industry. So I think this is the only logarithmic periodization that we will be looking at. Now, I said that one of the criticisms of the ancient, medieval, modern periodization is that although it works for Europe, it doesn't work for China and India, even though those societies were in communication with Europe and ought to have undergone similar transformations at similar times. Well, Lepois finds that there is a periodization that involves changes in social institutions that do seem to be synchronized across Eurasia. Specifically, he identifies 4 periods, each of 375 years, that are equally significant in the West, in Russia and in China, so a large part of Eurasia. So starting in the West, around 500 to 875, he says that's, as he calls it, the low Middle Ages, or as we suggested earlier, as many call it, the early Middle Ages. And then from 875 to 1250 is the High Middle Ages, the flourishing of the medieval world. And then from 1250 to 1625 is a time of the Renaissance and Reformation. And then from 1625 to today is the modern world with the emergence of North America as a centre of Western civilization. And associated with this is the decline of absolutist monarchies and replacement with republican and democratic forms of politics with constitutional monarchies. And in Russia, starting back here at the 500 to 875 period, this was a time when Russia was occupied by the Slavs and the Avars, who were rather primitive people, village level societies with very simple agriculture. And then in the next period, they came under the influence of the Byzantine Empire and the Vikings. So from the Byzantines, they acquired the Orthodox religion, and the Vikings conquered the Slavs and provided them with an aristocracy. And then in the next phase, this was the time of the Mongol conquest. So Russia came under the dominance of the Mongols, and then the princes of Muscovy drove out the Mongols and re-established Russian independence. And then finally, this period begins with Russia's last dynasty of the Romanovs and changed into communism. And then lastly, in China, this period is the time of the Sui and the Tang, who I said were dynasties that were when China was peaceful and unified. And that was then followed by the period of the Five Dynasties and the Song, which was a time of conflict and fragmentation in China. And then came, in the next period, the Yuan, who were the Mongols, the same as in Russia, conquering China, and the Ming dynasty, again, times of restoration of order, unity, and peace. And the Ming renewed Chinese rule as the princes of Muscovy renewed Russian rule over Russia. And then in this last phase, again, as like the Romanovs, it was a time of China's last imperial dynasty, the Qing, and then developed into republicanism and communism. So in all these periods, an emergence of more popular forms of government away from absolutist rulers. And finally, Lepoix presents a periodization of United States history. So specifically, he divides it up into 3 periods, each of about 70 years. And for each one, he discusses the character of the period, a key question that was being addressed during that period, a highly rated president who dealt with that question, and then also a follow-up question and a follow-up president who dealt with it. So for the first period, from 1790 to 1860, he says the character of that period was the physical growth of the United States to continental scale. So the acquisition of successive states and territories until the United States stretched from the east coast to the west coast, so from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the fundamental question being addressed in this period, he suggests, was other countries' role in North America. And the highly rated president who is particularly responsible for addressing this is George Washington, who particularly dealt with the question of Britain's role in North America and in the American War of Independence. And the answer to this question was, that they had no role in North America. And then the follow-up question was whether the new United States should be a series of rival factions or whether it would be a united country. And the follow-up president who dealt with that was the 7th President, Andrew Jackson, who did much to achieve the coherence of the new United States, including some controversial actions of taking over Indian territories. And then in the second period, he suggests that the character of that time was a transition based on technology and population growth. So this was a time when the United States went from the Wild West to an advanced industrial economy and really the workhouse of the world. And the fundamental question of this time was whether people in the United States should have common rights and opportunity or separate rights and opportunity. And the president who dealt with that was Lincoln. So, he did much to keep the northern and southern states together in a common country. And part of that Civil War was the abolition of slavery, which established that then anybody living in the United States, you should have common rights and opportunities. Now, not immediately, but this was what evolved over that period, thanks to the abolition of slavery. And then the follow-up question he identifies as whether the United States should be characterized by socialism or the free market. And the follow-up president who dealt with that was Theodore Roosevelt, who did much to promote the free market, breaking up the large capitalist monopolies, and but also took an interest in social programs, things like the health of workers. And then the last period from 1932 to 2000, he suggests the character of this period is the growing global leadership role of the United States. And so the question of this period is, what is the US role in the world? What should it be? And the highly rated president who particularly dealt with this question was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And this is why we have the period ends here in 1932, because that was the beginning of FDR's presidency in 1933. And so, yes, FDR took the United States into the Second World War, which led to, or from which the United States emerged as the world's leading superpower, even though Roosevelt himself may not have lived to see that. And the follow-up question is, the scale of defense spending. And so should the United States keep this under a tight budget, or should it spend large to project power around the world and act as, the world's policeman? And the follow-up president who particularly addressed this, Lepore suggests, is Ronald Reagan, who, with his Star Wars initiatives, certainly increased the defense budget and emphasized US power projection. And the last thinker on periodization that we'll consider is the theoretical historian Jerry Bentley, who suggests a periodization in terms of cross-cultural interaction. So he identifies these 6 periods in terms of the degree of interaction between cultures. So from 3200 to 2500 BC, this was the time of the first complex societies, which then brought together little local cultures into a unified state. Still a modest form of cross-cultural interaction. And then from 2000 to 500 BC, you have the ancient civilizations, which certainly interacted regionally. They traded with each other, and they built some modest empires. And then from 500 BC to AD 500, you have the period of classical civilizations. So these built very large empires. Alexander the Great, from Greece to Egypt to India, and the Roman Empire, bringing the whole Mediterranean under their control. And then from 500 to 1000 is the post-classical age. This is in fact a time of retreat and decrease in cross-cultural interaction. And then from 1000 to 1500 you have the trans-regional nomadic empires, so the Mongols and Tamerlane, who roamed across much of Eurasia from the Far East to Eastern Europe, bringing the whole into one empire, and facilitating trade across that huge space. And then 1500 to present, the modern age, with the European colonial empires, so bringing the whole world really into the scope of empire and global trade.